The release is then not quite as important as the attack. And you might have even an auto release option in your compressor, and you can just use that because it doesn't really matter that as much as the attack. But again, the release has to be long enough that when the compressor stops biting down on the sound, that it doesn't jump, or that it doesn't cause any kind of undue pumping in the sound itself. So you can imagine that the compressor is pulling it down. The envelope, the release is too short, and the compressor stops, and then the original sound jumps back up. So you want the release to be long enough to cover the fall of a note, or the rhythm. It has to be basically kind of, if it's a rhythmic part, it has which doesn't go back down to zero, kind of in terms of amplitude. The release has to be set to go with the rhythm of the material. If it's on individual notes, then it has to be set long enough that it lets that entire note decay without becoming obvious. So that can be a little bit tricky to set up, but the simple way to do it is to put the ratio quite high, maybe 5:1 or even up to 10:1. Put the threshold quite low, so you've got quite a lot of compression going on, and you can hear it quite obviously, and then set the release accordingly to the material, because it completely depends on the track. It depends on what that source material is. It depends on the tempo. So you can't just say use 100 milliseconds release all the time, because it depends on that track and it depends on that application. So you got to be able to hear what you're doing, and then be able to actually tune the release control accordingly. So one trick of being able to hear what you're doing is to use, just to set up the timing, is to set a very high ratio and a very low threshold. So you've got a lot of compression going on, and you can actually hear it quite obviously, and then set your attack and release accordingly, and then put the ratio and the threshold back to something more appropriate. Okay, so the ratio is the amount of dynamic loss you're going to have when the compressor is triggered. For mastering purposes, you might use a compressor with a 1 to 1.5, maybe 2 ratio. For most purposes, you're talking about 3:1, 5:1. If you're doing drums or something like that, 4:1, 5:1 ratio might be useful. You might even go as far as 7, 8, 9:1 for a kick drum track on a trance music or techno music or something like this. But this would be, it's quite extreme. If you're going above 5 or 6 would be considered kind of, you need to have a good reason for doing what you're doing. So once you basically would set the ratio kind of at the beginning, because you're kind of going to know what it is you're going to do with that compressor. You got to know from the beginning, I'm just doing a gentle amount of compression on an overall mix. That's then I'll use a 1.5:1 ratio. If I'm doing a drum percussion part, I'll do a 4:1 ratio. And you just start from that, and maybe tune it later, but generally you're going to have to know what you're going to do with the compressor before you set the ratio. Once you get those controls dialed in, then you can begin to use the threshold to set the trigger point for the compressor. You can basically do this by ear, or you can do it by looking at the gain reduction meter. So again, setting the threshold until you get a gain reduction of 3 or 4 dB, you should be able to get some kind of effect out of it. You kind of know what's going on, and maybe more. But basically, then you're just tuning or setting the threshold to get the amount of compression required. And again, it depends on the application. So it depends on the source material. So if you have a really badly recorded acoustic guitar, you might have to use a lot of compression. If you have a synthesizer part that came out of a plugin, it's probably got a compressor on it already. It's probably pretty level in comparison to acoustic material, which is generally got a very wide dynamic range. So it completely depends on the application. And the other trick would be to, instead of taking one compressor and using 10 dB of gain reduction to get something where you want it to be, is to split that between 2 compressors, each maybe 5 dB of gain reduction, or even 3 compressors, each with like 3 dB of gain reduction. And it will basically sound much, much better having less gain reduction per compressor and stacking compressors than it will having one compressor that does the same amount of gain reduction. It generally always sounds better to split the task. So you can kind of just, if you're using plugins, you can just copy and paste the same compressor several times. You will have to change the threshold on each one because the level going into the next one will be different than what went into the first. So you'll have to tune each one individually, but you can use the same attack release ratio settings. The other thing is, which is quite important if you're just A/B-ing plugins, is to make sure that you have a makeup gain control, so that if you A/B, if you bypass that plugin, you get the level doesn't jump. So although we're talking about a dynamics processor, which is affecting the volume, you want to set the markup on the control so that when you bypass it, it doesn't initially jump out and the volume isn't jumping high or low compared to the original source material. So if it's jumping higher, if the volume is higher when you have the compressor in, you'll think it's better. You'll just automatically, we think that it sounds better when it's louder. So it's important to have the markup. Basically, if you have like 3 dB of gain reduction on the meter, you just set it, the simple way is just set the markup of 3 dB. So you're adding 3 dB for the 3 dB that's been lost during the compression. You might have to tweak that a little bit to get it to sound more realistic in terms of volume, because it's not just the peak, it can be like the average, and the perception of volume is different than what it shows on the meter. But the only way of really telling what's going on with the compressor as well is if you can actually hear the difference compared to the original material. So the volume, it's a very good idea to set up the markup gain or the offset, if there is one, like so that when you bypass it, it has the same perceived volume as when the compressor is out of the circuit. So out of the circuit and in the circuit. So basically it's then you can actually A/B compare, and then you kind of know whether you're actually damaging the material too much or whether you're actually helping it. So one application is removing the too many peaks in one element which are sticking out in the mix, which might make it difficult to actually mix the track. If you've got some elements that are just coming out at certain times, they're too loud. So that's the simple application of a compressor. So the compressor might not be triggered through the entire track, and it might just only come in at one point, or it might just come in, say, on one vocal part, but not the rest, or it might come in more extreme on one vocal part or one element than the other parts. That would be kind of just to help level it off a little bit for mixing. Other applications are transients. What you can do is you can, with that attack again, you can let the attack of a sound through, and then you can pull down sharply on the rest, on the body and the release, which means that you're emphasizing the attack, which is the same as these transient designer. Basically a transient designer, which you're using to emphasize the attack of a sound, is just a compressor. That's all it is, with a really high ratio and a really low threshold and a lot of markup gain, so that you can get exactly the same sound from a normal compressor. So basically you can use it to emphasize the attack of a sound, which is to bring out the transients, or you can also use it to, with a fast attack, you can use it to pull down the transients. So it's quite useful in that way, and it's not just for leveling a sound, you can also use it to bring out the attack. Thanks for watching, and you can always subscribe if this is on YouTube or one of these sites, and if it's on the Studio Wizard site, then you can send me your email and I'll keep you updated of future videos and so on. And if you have any questions, just post them in comments or just contact me directly. I'm pretty happy to answer any questions about mixing, tracking, whatever it is studio related. Okay, that's great. Thanks. Bye.